We first want to welcome you to our webinar, and we will actually begin right at 12 o'clock or right at 3 o'clock. So welcome to our webinar, The History of American Food Policy and Marginalized Communities. Before we begin, all of us at the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health respectfully acknowledge that our advocacy, education, and learning across the country takes place on the occupied and unceded lands of many Native American tribes. To acknowledge this land is to recognize its long history and our place in that history. It is to recognize these lands and waters and their significance for the peoples who lived and continue to live in this country and whose practices and spiritualities were, are, and shall always be tied to the land and the water. Today's webinar is the fourth in our 2023 Climate Justice webinar series as part of the Climate and Health Equity Fellowship Program. The CHEF program recognizes the need for more diversity in climate and health leadership and a sharper focus on equitable climate solutions. The goal of the fellowship is to empower doctors of color from populations that face greater burdens from climate effects and are underrepresented in medicine to become leaders in climate and health equity, education, advocacy, and policy solutions. I'm Dr. Venice Curry, the Western Associate Director for Climate, Health, and Equity Fellowship, and also joining me from the consortium to run this webinar are our Digital Communications and Multimedia Program Assistant, Clarissa Payton, and Dr. Kimberly Williams, Program Manager. They will be available through the chat to answer any questions, any technical questions during the webinar. Our other team members on the webinar are Jordan Curry Carter, Program Manager, and Dr. Shanita Johnson, Deputy Climate and Health Equity Fellowship Director. The webinar series is hosted by the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health Equity, and the link will be put in the chat. It is held on 1 hour on the second Friday of each month from 3 p.m. to 4 p.m. Eastern Time. Today's webinar will be recorded and made available on our website for future viewing as part of the Equity Resources page on the consortium's website. This year, we are pleased to offer CME credit for our webinars, and instructions on obtaining credit will be provided at the end of the webinar. Today, we are honored to have Dr. Mark Mitchell, the Director of the Climate and Health Equity Fellowship Program, as our speaker. And honestly, rather than use any of our additional time to provide further description of his impressive work, we're placing his link in the chat, placing the link to his bio in the chat, and you can review it there. As a healthcare provider, it is really important that we consider the role that healthcare systems and providers play in regards to climate and health. In this webinar, Dr. Mitchell will discuss the history of American food policy and its impact on marginalized communities. The general format for today's webinar will be one 40-minute presentation by our speaker, followed by 10 minutes of questions and answers from our audience. We ask that you put any comments, links, or resources that you may recommend or any questions that you have in the chat box at any time during the presentation, and we will get to as many of the questions as we can during the Q&A period. We do ask that you would mute yourself so that we are not interrupted by any background noise. And without further ado, we're going to turn it over to Dr. Mitchell. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Curry. Let me share my screen. Okay. Today I'm going to talk about the history of American food policy and marginalized communities. Have a lot to cover, so I will proceed. So I have no financial disclosures. We will start talking about colonization. We'll talk about slavery in the U.S. economic prosperity, then industrialization period. We'll cover the post-Civil War period with, and then we will move in to today's food system and health equity. As part of that, we'll talk about how agriculture affects climate, how climate affects agriculture. We will talk a little bit about indigenous peoples and their relationship to food. And then we will we'll try to pull it all together in the Farm Bill and end up with an analysis of some climate and food justice reforms that are needed still. So again, for centuries, Native Americans lived in harmony with nature in North America and throughout the Americas. They were sharing traditional knowledge of sustainable practices and mutually nurturing food practices. In September of 1620, European pilgrims landed on Cape Cod, and more than half of the 100 Europeans died during the first winter because of poor nutrition and inadequate housing. The native inhabitants, the Wampanoag peoples, welcomed the visitors. They taught them how to plant local crops, how to fish, how to tap the maple trees for syrup, and how to hunt beaver. This enabled the Europeans to not only survive, but to thrive thereafter. The pilgrims shared a meal with some of the native peoples in the fall of 1621, which established the basis for Thanksgiving. As this new country developed, from its roots, we had slavery. And this was particularly true in the southern colonies and states, which had more of an agricultural base. The slaves were the primary source of physical labor on the plantation. It started originally with Native Americans and poor Europeans that were indentured servants, serving for a number of years, and then were free. They had Native American slaves, but then they were all replaced exclusively with Africans kidnapped and enslaved in the Americas. The food grown included rice, cotton, wheat, and sugarcane as cash crops. Originally the crops were placed, people planted for survival. But then we started raising crops to be sold for cash. And the free labor from slavery helped to build the wealth of this country. And in fact, 75% of the world's cotton was produced in the United States just prior to the Civil War. And the reliance on cotton and on agriculture wasn't just in the South. The industrialized northern states, the economy was built on agriculture, on the sale of here in New England, where I live, we had a lot of mills that would mill the cotton into clothing, and that those would be sold around the world. And the banks in New York City were buying and selling all of these agricultural goods, as well as buying and selling. The people bought, they were buying and selling people. So the African Americans developed skills limited to agriculture or the trades. as you know, it was illegal for slaves to learn to read and write or to speak in their native languages. So our history was taken from us. African American history was taken from us, from our forefathers who were slaves, and the country was built on the slave labor. So during the industrialization period, subsistence farming was dominant in the U.S. Prior to much of the Industrial Revolution. And so again, the first cotton mill was, and then there was advancements in the farm equipment and technology, reducing the need for farm hands. And as industrial continued and work for rural farm workers declined, Americans moved to urban areas looking for factory work. And it wasn't until the 1910s to the 1920s that the majority of the US population was in urban areas. So in 1865, right after the Civil War, Union General William Sherman issued Special Field Order number 15, which declared that the newly freed slaves be promised 40 acres of land and a mule as reparations for their time as slaves. The slaves again had no other source of wealth. They had to figure out how to live on their own. This land that was promised was sourced from 400,000 acres of land that was formerly owned by Confederate landowners, particularly along the Atlantic coast and islands off of the coast. And this land, of course, was traditionally Native American land before it was confiscated by the Confederate landowners. So if that field order had gone into effect, it would have provided freed slaves with the opportunity to own land and to become economically self-sufficient. But following the death of President Lincoln, Andrew Johnson revoked the special field order, and the promised acreage was retained by its white owners. After slavery, there were a number of racialized laws and policies, oftentimes called Jim Crow laws, and then the policy of sharecropping went into effect. So the freedmen, the freed slaves who were without land or other skills had very few options other than to going back to their former slave owners and sharecropping on their land. Many factory jobs that were open at that time were not open to African Americans or other ethnic minority populations because of the discriminatory practices and laws that the racial discrimination and also the laws favoring landowners. So many sharecroppers were chronically indebted to the landowners and to the local merchants. So sharecropping means that they would have a plot of land. They would be given a plot of land to take care of. They wouldn't own the land, they would rent the land. And they would grow crops on the land and that they would, at the end of the season, sell their crops. But that, although this sounds like it would be a good deal, there were many problems with sharecropping. One is that there were high interest rates for the loans for the equipment and the seeds and the fertilizer that were needed to grow crops. The rent costs for the plots of land were very high, and there were laws that made it difficult or even illegal to sell crops or harvest to anyone besides their landlords, who were often the previous slave owners, who severely undervalued the crops. They would pay much less than the actual value of the crops. So want to skip ahead to health equity and today's food system. So wanted to define food insecurity, which is lack of access to food needed for active, healthy life. And so 14% of all households are considered to be food insecure. However, more than twice that percentage of Blacks and Latinos are food insecure. When we talk about food insecurity, we're not only talking about malnutrition, undernutrition and underconsumption, we're also talking about overconsumption, which is, of course, malnutrition, obesity, which leads to diabetes and cardiovascular disease. And we hear a lot about food deserts. And so what we mean by food deserts is that there's lack of access to fresh, nutritious fruits and vegetables. There may be a lot of fast food places in urban areas. And the low cost, low nutrient processed food is more available. And these foods have more fat, sugar, and salt. So I want to talk a little bit about how how agriculture affects the climate. You know, we are here to talk about climate, and agriculture actually is a major contributor to greenhouse gases. 9% of greenhouse gases are attributable to agriculture, and more than half of methane emissions come from agriculture, mostly from cattle and other livestock, goats, but most other, chicken, turkey have a lot less, pork have produce a lot less methane emissions. 84% of nitrous oxides emissions are from agriculture, mostly from the production of fertilizer. Agriculture is very energy intensive. Again, 17% of fossil fuels are used in agriculture. And agriculture is also very water intensive. 70% of the water used globally goes to agriculture. And a lot of that goes to the food for livestock, the corn, the wheat, that has to be grown and then fed to livestock, and all of that is very water intensive. And the water that they use is oftentimes taken from wells and aquifers, and contributes to drought. So how does climate change affect food production? So climate change affects agriculture, food production. It also affects processing and distribution of food. So crop yields are reduced by heat, by drought, and on the other hand, by floods and other extreme weather. For example, there's in 2020 and since then, there have been straight line damage to acres and acres of crops in the upper Midwest. And the warmer temperatures are not conducive to growing nuts and tree fruits and avocados, which require a number of hours in the cold. They call it chill hours. And if they don't have enough exposure to the cold, you can't grow these crops. The yields for these crops are much lower. Ozone, which is the air an air pollutant associated with in the increased heat, affects the soybean production, wheat production, oats, green beans, and peppers directly. Heat stress also reduces milk production in cows and egg production in chickens. The carbon dioxide reduces the protein and micronutrients in a number of different crops, like barley, soy, and sorghum. And by micronutrients, we mean calcium, zinc, iron, and other minerals and vitamins. So how does climate change affect fish and seafood? There are fish kills from algae blooms, and ocean acidification from carbon dioxide. The drought prevents fish that need to go upstream and to spawn into rivers and others. Floods can contribute to contaminated shellfish and algae blooms. You may have heard this last week that the temperatures in the Atlantic around Florida have gotten up to 98 degrees. And so obviously it bleaches the coral and kills the coral, and has a number of other effects. So wanted to talk a little bit about indigenous cultures. Indigenous people have traditionally have spiritual connections with nature, and many Native American and Alaska Native cultures include subsistence hunting, subsistence gathering, subsistence farming, and fishing. Sea level rise threatens freshwater and saltwater fish habitats, and the sea ice melting threatens Alaskan fishing. The polar bears you see in this, rely on there being enough ice for them to swim from iceberg to iceberg, and then to be able to hunt to catch the fish. But as the ice is melting, it certainly threatens polar bears and other, and the Native Alaskans don't have access to their traditional diets, seals and sea lions and whales, like they did before. And the permafrost in Alaska is also melting, and this threatens transportation. They rely on frozen lakes to walk across the lakes and to get across the lakes. The permafrost means that the houses are failing, they're falling into the ocean, and then they also threatens the water and the access to fish. So what's being done about all of this? The policy to try to address all of these issues is called the Farm Bill. The U.S. Farm Bill is a primary piece of legislation that describes, drives how farming is done and where farming is done and what kind of farming is done in this country. The original bill was enacted by President Franklin Roosevelt in 1933, and their original priorities are still the priorities today. That is, number one, to keep food prices fair for both farmers and fair for the consumers. Two, to ensure that there's an adequate food supply, and three, to protect and sustain the U.S. Natural resources. And that is, of course, becoming even more important now with climate change and global warming. So the Farm Bill is updated about every 5 years. And this year, 2023, it's now being considered to be updated. But the Farm Bill is very, very, very complicated. It has many sections to it and many policies. And so it has 12 main titles, and that they're each of these policies and laws are brought together under. And so these titles or sections of the Farm Bill include the nutrition programs, loan servicing for loans to farmers, insurance for crop insurance, we'll cover a lot of that, conservation, livestock protection, and incentives for growing certain crops and where they can be grown and where they should not be grown, as well as incentives for certain farming practices. So the focus of the crops that are grown in the U.S. That are subsidized by the Farm Bill are commodity crops. Commodity crops are defined in the U.S. Farm Bill. They're often non-perishable, able to be stored for long periods of time, and easily transported long distance. The federal government actually controls the supply of these crops, protecting the farmer's income. And the purpose of that is to make the food cheaper and more plentiful. And for the previous Farm Bill, the 2015 to 2019 Farm Bill, the average production of crops was corn, was 14 billion bushels of corn is the #1 crop. The #2 crop is soybeans, and instead of 14 billion bushels, soybeans is 4 billion. And then barley is a distant third with 160 million bushels. We used to say the fields of wheat and so on like that, but wheat is no longer produced very much in the United States because of the Farm Bill, because of the federal government is promoting corn. So how do they use the corn? The corn is primarily used as feed for cattle and other animals. And in fact, 95% of the total feed grain produced and used is corn. Not wheat, not barley, not other crops. Corn is also used in a variety of other consumables and commercial products. It's used in corn starch to get starchy substances. It's used for high fructose corn syrup, used instead of sugar, corn oil instead of lots of other oils, alcohol, and fuel ethanol. That there is a requirement to have ethanol put into fuel, supposedly to help with the climate. So the demand for fuel ethanol has led to increases in the acreage used for corn crops, and again, to reduce the dependency on foreign fossil fuels, and fossil fuels in general. But corn actually requires 25% more fossil fuel energy to convert to ethanol than the amount of fuel that it actually produces. So in addition to that, the USDA, Department of Agriculture, has a long history of racial discrimination. The USDA has been successfully sued for discriminatory lending practices against African-American farmers, where they got $1.2 billion in settlement, against Latino farmers, who got $1.2 to $1.3 billion settlement, against Native American farmers, where they got $760 million settlement, and female farmers, where they got $1.2 to $1.33 billion settlement. But the Department of Agriculture still provides 50% less funding to African-American farmers than it does to white farmers. A lot of this is determined by the local or the county extension of the Farm Bureau, the USDA, the Department of Agriculture. So the current Farm Bill is the Agricultural Improvement Act of 2018. And the 2018 bill is projected to cost $867 billion over 10 years. These are old figures. The actual cost is apparently larger than that, over 900 billion. It had been projected to decrease from the 2014 bill, and the nutrition programs in the 2018 legislation was expected to account for 76% of the bill's budget. But there was a provision in the bill saying that the federal government should look into SNAP, which is previously known as food stamps, and find out whether that was an adequate amount of funding for the supplemental food needed by low-income people. The study showed that it was not, and that the SNAP amounts needed to be increased. And so the federal government did that under the Biden administration, and also under the Trump administration. They increased the amount of SNAP benefits, so that they now account for more than 80% of the Farm Bill. And so they provide financing to grocery stores that open in locations in the food deserts. But the 2018 bill was really highly supportive of big agriculture, as opposed to the small farmers. And during 2020, during the pandemic, 39%, almost 40% of all farm income was from the Farm Bill. So what was the effect of the Agriculture Improvement Act of 2018 on climate change? So there were some improvements in that bill, and that the farmers can benefit from climate change friendly farm practices. There was some funding for that. There was a 75% cost match for installment of certain conservation measures. They could identify the top 10 most effective conservation practices in your county or state to be eligible for greater funding for farmers. And the federal crop insurance allowed greater use of cover crops. such as clover that would be planted in the off season, which are beneficial to increasing the fertility of the soil and preventing the soil from blowing away, the most fertile soil from being blown away. Traditionally they say, till the soil, but now they don't till soil anymore because they found that the topsoil blows away and decreases fertility. So now they're promoting cover crops to enhance the fertility of the land. But there were also setbacks in the 2018 Agricultural Improvement Act, or the Farm Bill. The Conservation Stewardship Program, which awards farmers for conservation practices, lost half of its funding. And then there were existing loopholes for large agribusinesses, and those were widened under the 2018 Act to provide farm owners and their extended family members large federal subsidies, which again was not beneficial to the small farmers and the non-industrial farmers, those that did not have the CAFOs and so again, the federal government subsidizes corn and other cash crops that are considered to be commodities, and they trade them on the stock market, the futures and so on like that. But this doesn't include the vegetables and fruits. And in fact, California is responsible for a third of all U.S. vegetables and 2/3 of U.S. fruits and nuts. But these markets are actually being more internationalized. So I don't know. There may be some updated figures from other of fruits and vegetables from other countries. And all of these need to be transported around the country for the U.S. consumers. Often they require refrigerated storage, and container ships, and railways, air freights. All of these produce greenhouse gases. And as we rely more on international trade of food, we also see more more greenhouse gas production. The food system accounts for roughly 10% of the U.S. energy consumed, and the food production system relies mainly on fossil fuels. Nearly a fifth of all fossil fuel used in the U.S. is used to power different stages of food production and transportation, storage, etc. And in addition to that, there's a lot of waste of food. About a third of all food produced is wasted. Let me repeat that. About a third of all food produced in the United States is wasted. In 2010, there were 103 billion pounds of food were wasted in the US. That was about $161 billion of grocery money. The food waste ends up in landfills where it decomposes and releases methane, which of course is a powerful greenhouse gas. 70% of the water consumed around the world, as I said before, is used for agriculture and food production. So we're wasting a lot of water also. And so there's limited sciences, and a lot of food has an expiration date on it. But those expiration dates don't really mean anything. There's really limited science behind those expiration dates, and sometimes, oftentimes, the food is still good despite those expiration dates. They're often just manufacturers' estimates and are not specific on whether they pertain to the safety of the food or the quality of the food, and or whether they're just ways of getting people to buy newer food. And so there's a question about, so what should be done? What are the solutions? You know, we try to focus our fellowship, our climate and health equity fellowship, on solutions. So here are some of the solutions that food justice advocates suggest. They think that we should be focusing on addressing national security and economic and public health in order to, first of all, restore and build soil health and to improve the natural ecosystems. And so that's to both build resilience, to improve nutrition, to increase the water retention, to reduce pollution, to promote biodiversity. You know, when we use chemical fertilizers and chemical and high yield crops, it reduces the biodiversity. But if we can promote sustainable agriculture, promote the sustainable crop growing, we can enrich the soil and promote the biodiversity in the soil, but also of other plants and animals. And we can become we believe, the food justice advocates believe that agriculture should become the economic foundation for rural areas. And we're wrapping up. So food justice advocates also believe that the national food goals should be refocused to provide more and better ecosystem support and ecosystem services. When we say ecosystem services, we're talking about natural systems that improve the earth and the climate and the soil and the air, to both purify the air and water, to increase the nutrient cycling into the soil, that decrease the erosion and increase the flood control, as well as removing carbon from the air and sequestering it underground. So these food policies can be more just and climate friendly. The local food systems can increase access to fresh fruits and vegetables. Individuals can eat less red meat and processed meat to reduce their heart disease and cancer, reduce the methane emissions, and conserve water and grains. And then they can also reduce food waste by redistributing it to those who need it. So here are some of the resources that I've used, and want to thank Ian Riley, who helped with the presentation, and thank the Center for Climate Change and the Public Health Institute in California for some of the materials. So I will stop there and stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Dr. Mitchell, for that comprehensive and really enlightening presentation. We now have time for questions from the audience. I remind you that you can type your questions into the chat. We'll get to as many as we can. But we also ask you to take a moment to fill out the webinar survey. The link will be placed in the chat as well. Kimberly, what questions do we have for Dr. Mark Mitchell?
So it looks like we have a raised hand by either Mr. or Dr. Saeed or
Doctors.
Saad. Ali, if you'd like to ask your question.
Yes, thank you so much. Thanks for that presentation, Dr. Mitchell. So I'm Ali Saad. We've met a few times, but for the group, I was a climate and health fellow at the University of Colorado last year, and I'm now affiliate faculty with the program. I'm a neurologist by training, and my focus is food systems' role in chronic disease and planetary health. So I'm all about this topic. I was very interested in this webinar. But Dr. Mitchell, I was wondering whether there's any work done on foods and on food deserts in this particular regard that I think isn't really talked about a lot, because whenever we talk about food deserts, we're always talking about fresh fruits and veggies, fresh meats, a lot of fresh foods. But at least in the US, a lot of food deserts will have communities that will get a lot of their foods from gas stations or from pharmacies, which will have a frozen food section. And that frozen food section can be stocked with frozen fruits and veggies that are going to be more nutritious, cheaper than fresh fruits and vegetables. They have that infrastructure with the freezers available for people. And then the shelves can also be lined with shelf-stable, cheap, and unprocessed healthy food like beans, lentils, nuts, legumes, stuff like that. So I was just wondering whether if any policy that's targeting that, because it is important to allow people to have access to farmers markets and to traditional supermarkets, but using that infrastructure that's already there, maybe changing policy around what these gas stations and these pharmacies are allowed to sell, or incentivizing them to sell healthier things in a cost-effective manner might be a good strategy.
Right. Yeah, I know that the USDA does allow that. I know that for example, here in Hartford, we have a food policy commission, and they encourage the small bodegas to be able to buy. They incentivize them to help them to be able to buy refrigerators and freezers to be able to store fresh vegetables. They provide technical assistance on placing fruits and vegetables, or vegetables near the door instead of having candy or chips right next to the door and next to the registers. So there are things that are happening, and I understand what you do. One of the things, I'm sure all of you do this, but you raise your hands if you go from city to city asking taxi drivers to take you to the ghetto so that you can look at the food sources in the ghetto. So raise your hands if you do that. So I do that. I have done that. And in some places, particularly in the South, we find that the dollar stores are the places where people can get a lot of food. And you talked about the gas stations and other places. And so that's what I agree with you. Yes, that's right. So yeah, USDA allows a lot of flexibility in what can be done, but oftentimes it takes local leaders and local groups to promote these kinds of things, because it's different in different places, and so that's why, yes, I think people like us, or people who have expertise in food policy can can take advantage of the options to promote access. Obviously there's the farmers markets and lots of other options that are available, but in some places, and aren't available in other places, but should be and can be made more available.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
One question in the chat before I get to some of the others with their hands raised. Dr. Mitchell, do you know how food waste in the US compares to other countries?
Not No, I don't know how it compares to other developed countries. But developing countries don't have the luxury of wasting the food like like we do. Um, but no, I don't know the answer.
Thank you. Dr. Hairston, you have a question? You want to unmute?
While she's putting up mute.
Sorry about that. Thank you. You were saying that the focus of the Farm Bill involves corn, soybeans, and barley. And corn is used to produce high fructose corn syrup, corn starch, et cetera, et cetera. And it seems like these farmers are incentivized to produce corn, which in turn is used for additives in foods. And those additives are harmful to our health. I mean, it increases the weight, which of course in turn, hypercholesterolemia, heart disease, the whole gamut. And it seems like they're incentivizing farmers to produce something that on the long run really makes our health worse, especially in areas where, like the gentleman said, areas where the fresh fruits and vegetables are not available. So people turn to the corner grocery stores to get canned foods and junk food that is full of this high fructose corn syrup and other corn additives. So it's just more of a concern than it is a question.
Yeah, and it's not the corn itself. Like I said, very little of the corn is actually consumed. So they spend millions of dollars doing research on how you can convert corn into lots of other things. And so the issue is not that there's high fructose corn syrup. The issue is that they're adding it to lots of products. I don't know whether that's any worse than sugar, but it's more available because of that. So I think the nutrition is a different issue than having corn. The Farm Bill pays farmers to make sure that the price of the commodity crops don't drop below a certain level. If they drop below a certain level, then they will pay the farmers the difference between the market level, the market price, and the and the price that they've guaranteed. And then they also buy a lot of the excess food, to distribute to schools and others. So yes. But yes, high fructose corn syrup is a problem, but it's not the corn, it's the corn syrup and where it's used.
Thank you for that. Ms. Deborah, I think you have your hand up next.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm new to your organization, Dr. Mark Mitchell. Thank you so much for your presentation. And I'm a nurse practitioner. I'm also a lifestyle medicine provider. And I am always interested in the intersectionality when we all come together, and being new to the organization, this movement, which is so important. I was wondering if you might speak for a minute to how those of us that are concerned about all of these issues could come together, and maybe some places where we already are. So in lifestyle medicine, we're very interested in the fact that 85% of the conditions that we're treating with pills and procedures are actually caused by diet and lifestyle. And unhealthy diet, as you were talking about, access to fresh fruits and vegetables and all, and access to places to walk safely in a neighborhood. And then we're extremely concerned, and all of medicine really is now about social determinants of health and the health disparities. And much of that, again, is related to the lifestyle factors. And then we have the food justice movement and getting these foods into communities. And then another group that's interested in this issue, as you talk about climate, is environmental, but we seem to piece that off, and environmental seems to be more involved in the issues of the energy grid and all. And yet we know that the unhealthy food that's driving sickness and social the determinants of health and those disparities is actually more about the food and a big driver of climate change. Could you share some recommendations for how we can where these might be already intersecting in terms of organizations and initiatives?
Yes, I'm glad you asked that question. Yeah, the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health, which of course co-sponsors the Chef Fellowship with the National Medical Association, is looking at the Farm Bill and is actually preparing a sign-on letter, which goes into a lot of depth about different sections and different programs within the Farm Bill and makes recommendations for that. And I believe that that'll be released within the next couple of weeks for sign-on. You know, and obviously your organization is part of the consortium also. And so, you know, hopefully you'll be able to you'll get that from multiple sources, hopefully. But if you don't see it within the next couple of weeks, check the website for the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health.
Thank you.
So I know that this discussion can go on and could go on much longer, but we do need to wrap up the session. So I want to thank our speaker, Dr. Mark Mitchell, and to thank all of you for participating in our webinar series. I hope that you found it useful and helpful. As a reminder, these webinars are held on the second Friday of the month. The next webinar is scheduled for August 11th, and the topic is housing and energy efficiency. Before you leave, we do ask that you take a moment to complete the webinar survey if you haven't already. Again, the link is in the chat. As announced at the start of the webinar, we are pleased to offer CME credit for our webinars. To claim the credit, please follow the link in the chart or scan the QR code on the screen and then just follow the directions. Today's activity code for claiming CME credit is 12912. And this now concludes our session. We hope that you have a great day and a safe weekend, and stay cool.
Thank you.
Thank you.